So we're here with Peter Greenaway. He's here to present his masterclass, Short Meets Peter Greenaway. And thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
I think we can start with the questions.
As you wish.
Okay. So your great interest in cinematography was born thanks to Bergman's The Seventh Seal. How are you inspired by it? What were the things that impressed you the most and that led you down the way of cinema?
Well, I can understand that you have read all the correct newspaper cuttings. So you've
Yes,
obviously done some homework. And it is true that I was, as a tender adolescent of about 15, certainly very fascinated by Ingmar Bergman. And we are talking, I suppose, about the end of the 1960s, a long time ago, certainly before you were born, yes?
Yes.
And I suppose, it's common enough. You know, we have mainstream cinema, which basically comes from Hollywood. But every now and again, certainly in the 1960s, there were little private cinemas that would show, should we say, offbeat sort of cinema. And as an adolescent, you know, about 15 or 16, and as a young man, you're desperately interested in sex. And the only place you can probably see sex in cinema, European, was probably from Scandinavia. You know, the other countries, certainly your Roman Catholic Italian country, you never saw a naked woman in an Italian film, but you certainly saw naked women in Scandinavian films. Now I say this with a smile on my face, and I hope you have got a smile on your face too. So it was well recognized that probably an Ingmar Bergman film had naked women, and if you do a checklist, you probably find that's absolutely true. So I was very friendly with a fat boy in my class. I was still at school. And he suggested we should bunk off school. We should, take the afternoon off and go to this little cinema he knew where Ingmar Bergman films went. And of course, when I actually got there, I suddenly realized, yes, indeed, there were naked women. But these films were deadly serious. You know, they were about religion and superstition, and all those things that would certainly be interesting to a 15-year-old male. And I saw a whole series of Ingmar Bergman films, which were indeed very interesting. And all those questions that adolescents ask. Here was cinema that answered some of those questions. But then one evening I went, there was this extraordinary film called Seventh Seal. Have any of you seen Seventh Seal? It's a very generational thing, this, isn't it? You generation probably are Tarantino fans rather than Ingmar Bergman fans. Okay, he smirks, so obviously he isn't. But it's all about context, isn't it? The zeitgeist, it all changes. Well, Ingmar Bergman then, Swedish atheist, that's another big problem, especially I suppose to you, basically Roman Catholic Italians. God to the English is dog, spelled backwards. So you could see how we were full of contempt towards notions of Roman Catholicism, for example. So, I was there to applaud all the things that interested me, atheism, sex, etc., etc. But I mean, these are quality films. I'm talking flippantly here, but these are quality films. And Ingmar Bergman was indeed about mysticism, was about surrealism, was certainly about sexual mores, etc., etc., etc. So I think that probably, I'm coming around, I'll eventually answer you in a minute, long answer to a short question. But there was something about this film which, was a really serious thought for people who were interested in existential situations. So you're right. But then, more or less about that time, the Nouvelle Vague began. Okay, I'm not so old that you don't know what the Nouvelle Vague is. You know the Nouvelle Vague, extraordinary flowering, based very largely on cheap, simple cameras like he's been following me around for the last 12 hours, and I see he's been carrying a cheap old camera. Okay, your camera's now electronic, and these are still mechanical, but people like Godard, and certainly Chris Marker, and René and Chabrol were experimentally looking probably just like him with a beard, you know, stroking his beard like he's stroking. They were real young people who were interested in cinema language, and they managed to get hold of cameras and started making movies. And then there were two brilliant movies, one called Breathless in English, which was made by Godard, and the other one made by Francois Truffaut called 400 Blows. So let's forget for a moment the Seventh Seal and move on to the next thing, which was interesting. So I think, you know, these young filmmakers, all of them lived in Paris. I think maybe one of them lived in Marseille, but most of them were Paris. And they set up a brand new, exciting, you know, sort of anti-Italian, you know, the Italian phrase telephone cinema? The white telephone cinema, are you familiar with that? Really boring, you know, sort of, you know, people came into the room, you had to open the door, you had to close the door, you had to walk across, you know, continuity and those sorts of boring Hollywood things were very, very, you know, passant, that was the way things are made. But suddenly came along these very exciting filmmakers who threw all that rubbish away. You don't need that sort of narrativity. And then very rapidly afterwards, I think, or maybe at the same time, I don't have the dates on my wrist, but probably the beginnings of post-neorealism. I'm not interested in Rossellini, I think it's very boring, but I am interested in the post-neorealists, the people who started to use cinema as a poetic medium rather than as a prosaic medium. I mean, you smirked when I said Rossellini, but you know what I mean. He's very much about the notions of, you know, street cameras and the notions of reality. And we know there's no such thing as reality. Reality is just as based upon devices and, you know, anti-realistic propositions. So, and I think probably then I would see a film like Fellini's La Dolce Vita. So that's the next step. And you can see how it's all moving around and so on. I was never really primarily interested in cinema. I'm a filmmaker by mistake. I don't really want to be a filmmaker either. Since the tender age of about 13 or 14, I always wanted to be a painter. Painting to me is the supreme visual art. Most of painting is basically illustrational, either of the Bible or, you know, Roman or Greek mythology. And it wasn't until the post-impressionists that suddenly painting became painting, and not simply illustration of text. Now I find that cinema is exactly the same thing. Most cinema is text-based. We have a text-based cinema. We do not have an image-based cinema. The image comes second. Just run your mind through all the films you've seen. They're either illustrated scripts. First of all, you have to have a text before you can goddamn have a picture, which seems to me terrible. Your grandmother, maybe not you, but your grandmother read Genesis, and in Genesis it says, in the beginning was the Word. Rubbish, rubbish. How can the beginning become with a word? You have to have something to describe the word with. You know, God sent Adam out to name everything, but how could poor old Adam name everything until he had something to name? So I had an installation at the Venice Biennale last year, and it was called In the Beginning Was the Image. And so it's always been my aim to make the most imagistic cinema possible. So much so, I mean, it doesn't necessarily fulfill most people's ideas, maybe even not your ideas, of what cinema should be. I think cinema is basically about theatrics and not about image. And I think probably most films are just simply recorded theatre, which seems to be a very poor way in which to engage in cinema. So, as my background as a painter, and I was having painting exhibitions, and that was my prime interest, I really tried to make films like painters make paintings. So very much auteur theory. Okay, you know, you get people saying that films are a collaborative event, of course they are, but I think the most successful films are dominated by a single imagination. So I'm really interested in a director's cinema. I'm not interested in writer's cinema. I'm not interested in an actor's cinema. And I think, again, you know, ever since about 1900, you know, post-impressionism, most painting is self-reflexive. Painters become painters not because they see the world, but because they see other paintings. So there's a way that I'm always interested in that self-reflexivity. So when you watch a Greenaway film, it's not a window on the world. It's not a view through a door. It's not a political polemic. It is basically about this self-reflexivity of seeing and looking and seeing. So much so that a lot of people think that I'm not a filmmaker at all, and I quite like that idea. I don't like filmmakers. You're not a filmmaker, are you?
No.
Okay, thank God for that. You're all filmmakers, though, proto-filmmakers. I hate filmmakers. They're so narrow, they're so limited, you know, and they're all interested in the things which cinema's got no interest in, like fame and money and fortune and getting birds, etc. So we, I think, have a deeply, deeply impoverished cinema. All sorts of extraordinary people at the beginning of the 19th century said that, or beginning of the 20th century, that cinema would be an amazing medium. I haven't seen it yet. Have you seen it yet? Cinema is, you know, a sort of bedtime stories for adults, and it's all based on text. So I'm still waiting. I was greatly excited by the whole digital revolution, so we throw away the stupid celluloid cameras, which were cumbersome and heavy and never allowed you what to do. And now, of course, like this gentleman here, we have cameras where, you know, you can ubiquitously be everywhere. But again, I suppose, you know, even the digital cinema still basically follows celluloid cinema. Same tropes, same paradigms, same structures, same fabrication, same distribution. I think probably the greatest thing that happened in the last, 15 years is YouTube. To get rid of all these stupid people in the middle so I can talk directly to an audience. Unfortunately, that's all falling apart, becoming totally commercialized and going the way the boring old celluloid cinema have. Okay, I'm rambling on here, and you're not stopping me, so I presume I can ramble on a bit longer. So this is basically, let's make a resume. I really do, I think, am behaving and acting like a painter, but using cinema as a medium. So that's making very, very personalized, poetic imagery. I remember an Italian journalist once said, "How is it, Mr. Greenaway, you began your career as a painter and now you're a filmmaker?" And I said I was always disappointed because paintings didn't have soundtracks. So basically, I am a painter working in the cinema, I think. I just love making images. And if they move and can be self-reflexive, 3 cheers. And if there isn't a story, 3 more cheers. Go to the cinema to be told a story. What a waste of time. You know, we have a huge amount of activities, the novel, you know, Homer 3,000 years ago writing lyric poetry. They're the people who handle text, they play with narrative. We have a writer's cinema, which is also a disaster. You know, we need a painter's cinema. But unfortunately, so few painters are actually filmmakers, which is a great tragedy. All filmmakers, you're not a script writer either, are you?
No,
because I think all script writers should be shot. Yes?
No, I'm not a script writer.
Okay. So, okay, you've got my ideas, you've got my prejudices now all wrapped up together. You're all smiling, so I can still go on talking.
Well, I have another question.
Go ahead.
Okay, it's linked to what you said actually, because in many films, such as The Drugs Man, Contract and Night Watching, it is presented a social critique towards the role of the artist society. Is art more a way to denounce certain mechanisms of society, or as more an aesthetic end in itself?
Well, you know, Marcel Duchamp said anything you want to call a painting is a painting. So it's up to you, your subjectivity. But I certainly think, you know, cultural pursuits are probably the most valuable thing that we have. You know, politics changes afternoon, religion changes, you know, from lunchtime to the evening meal. And religion's all a complete waste of time. But again, you know, people need to be nurtured and they need to be learned how to, you know, brainwashed and all these other things. But I think there is the opportunity of cultural pursuits. You know, they have longevity. They stay. You were not interested, for example, in Egyptian religions, but we're still fascinated by their artifacts and by their notions of death, etc. Those ideas don't go away. And I think art, you know, certainly for me, for painting, offers alternatives to the establishment. And I think it's always valuable. It's always the alternative voice. I think the very best cinema is always uncomfortable, should make you feel uncomfortable. And this is not support for Tarantino because he's uncomfortable in very obvious and boring ways. But I think, we should challenge the status quo all the time. So it's almost obligatory for artists to be uncomfortable. And you and I can think of hundreds of thousands of examples where that's true. And hopefully it still should be true. So, let's say for me, still painting is much more interesting than cinema. We have at least 8,000 years of painting made by many, many, many different sorts of people all across the Western world. But we've only had, 120 years of cinema, more or less, very, very short. So how can you compare 8,000 years with 120? So there's a way in which cinema is very, very infantile. It's still a fetus in the womb. It still hasn't found its own métier. But just as I feel, that painting should be non-narrative, the very best paintings are non-narrative, they don't tell you stories, we should develop a cinema which is non-narrative too. Because that's not the way, I believe, to somehow insult the image by fixing it into a narrative. Have I said enough that's provocative?
Yeah, so, thank you. And then, some of the most important themes of your works are sexuality and death, and they are often depicted using the human body as canvas. Why are you particularly interested in those themes, and how are they related to the representation on the human body? Is your interest in them related?
God, you're sounding like a film magazine, aren't you? There is a way, there are only two subject matters of interest, you know that. One is sex, and the other's death. These are the big, 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 existential questions. And we're all related to them, whatever culture there are in the world. I think Balzac said that money was an important subject matter, but that cannot be true. So many stupid people have money. How can money be important? And I think Shakespeare would talk about power. Well, thinking about American politics and Mr. Trump, obviously power is very important. But I think both the notions of money and power are subsumed in the two subjects of sex and death. I don't know. I think probably most of us now, even in this Roman Catholic country of yours, are atheists, yes? Maybe we could excuse one or two agnostics, but most people have said goodbye to God and Satan and all that shit, all that rubbish, which has, dominated Western thought for 2,000 years. So I don't believe that, any form of religion, not necessarily Christianity, but any other form, is really relevant to your innermost being, but certainly sex is. Sex represented by the moment of conception. So I'm not talking about birth, I'm not talking about children, I'm not even talking about love, which is all zeitgeist associated and contextual. I'm suggesting, that magic moment when finally you are created. And we don't know much about it. I think Salvador Dali reckoned he was around when his parents fucked, but that's Salvador Dali, he's allowed to say that. And also death, the moment of death is virtually invisible to us all. And we might, I think, probably being all good atheists now, not really frightened of death anymore, but we're obviously frightened of dying, which could be, painful. Most people are living far too long now. There's no point living any longer if you have to die of heart disease or painful cancer. So I think the ambition to live forever is really very, very stupid. It's not going to happen anyway. But I think, again, most of our conversations are either about sex, Romeo and Juliet, all the way to Sex in the City, it's always, 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 always there. And of course the moment of the void, which is certainly, I'm very sorry, but I'm absolutely convinced you're going to die. I don't think you'll ever be exceptional. So these have to be the big, big existential subjects. And they are the subjects basically of all literature. They're the subjects certainly of all cinema. And I suppose, most of our cultural life is between these two phenomena. So, I would answer your question, if we don't talk about sex, if we don't talk about death, what are we going to talk about? There's nothing else of interest.
But the other part of the question was about you using the human body to depict this.
You have a human body, I have a human body, these good people have human bodies. We all know about the human body, it's a universal subject. We all know that we have hearts and heads and pricks and vaginas and limbs and toes. It's a universal subject matter. And however it's depicted, whether you're Japanese or Eskimo or Hollywood or English or indeed Italian, there's a great, great common language there. We know about it. And therefore, it's the language I think we should use. I'm trained as a painter. I was in art school for 4 years. Every Wednesday afternoon, every Thursday morning, we drew the human body naked. And if the model didn't turn up, then our students had to take our clothes off and be drawn or painted. So the familiarity with the human body, is not my problem. It might be your problem, but it's not my problem. And I sincerely believe that, by talking about the human body and who we are, and, how we stand, how we fall, how we lie, how we sleep, is always going to be an enormous interest. I suppose, the human body has been a subject, hasn't it? Think of Michelangelo's nudes on the Sistine Chapel. And now we're all becoming, freed from all these sexual hang-ups about homosexuality and intersexuality, but long last, taking us an awful long time to get there, but gradually it's all opening up. Then I think, the sexual anatomical being is an essential part of the vocabulary of all our cultural activities, and that includes cinema. Most Hollywood actors take their clothes off as a prelude to sex. I'm sure you don't take your clothes off all the time as a prelude to sex, and I'm sure these people don't. There's a way we should be much more associated and familiar and happy with the notion of our anatomical selves. So I always want to make that part of a cinematic vocabulary.
Thank you. What kind of advices would you give to young filmmakers? You're an eclectic artist. Would you think that a wide knowledge in different disciplines is fundamental for a career in cinema?
I would say don't become filmmakers. Cinema is dying. It's dying very, very fast indeed. When you go to see a contemporary film, do you actually think it's a film anymore? The differences between the so-called documentary and the so-called feature film are almost invisible. There is a way that, cinema to my grandfather was a phenomenon you went to see in company. Large numbers of people where the screen was bigger and noisier than you are. Most of us now watch our films at home, in bed, in the office, in a place like this. And we probably watch them with a very, very small company. And we probably watch them, as I'm sure most of us do, on our own. So that notion of big audiences as the public phenomenon has completely changed. And also I think, it doesn't sound necessarily such a momentous event, but I think it's very important. We can watch cinema now anytime we like. We don't have to wait for 6 o'clock next Sunday to get the new Ridley Scott movie. We can watch it in 5 minutes' time, which somehow makes it very cheap, very vulgar, very approachable. So therefore it doesn't have the significance it used to have. It's like wallpaper now. Do you go home and watch your wallpaper? I don't. No, it's not a very interesting thing, is it? And cinema is so ubiquitous, at the push of a button, I have access to at least 25 million films. And this ubiquity somehow has changed the glamour and the sense of occasion that cinema used to have. And cinema was invented really basically as a cheap form of entertainment that the proletariat could use and could go on a Saturday night, with their girlfriends and their wives and their children. That's completely changed. I'm not necessarily saying it's any worse, because, your use of that thing has really enfranchised you. Not only can you interview Peter Greenaway, but you can do anything else with that thing. It used to be a telephone, but now you can cook a zebra, kill your mistress, do virtually anything you like with that. So its primary uses has disappeared. And I don't have to tell you, cinemas have been closing down all over the world, turning into bowling alleys, whatever else. You don't need the cinema anymore. So in answer to your question, don't be a filmmaker. You're wasting your time. You can be involved in what that thing does, but don't think of it indeed as a vehicle for telling stories anymore. We have to find other purposes for it. If I can make a sort of evolutionary parallel, the great beasts that used to walk the earth were dinosaurs, big and clumsy and rapacious, etc., etc. But we, as hominoids, post being monkey, we came out of the floor of the jungle, didn't we? Out of the leaf mold. We weren't big and dangerous with big teeth. A little humble, little furry brown jobs. Yes. And that's the next evolution, and that's the equivalent of a little furry blowjob. You know, the ability for us to communicate instantaneously, that's what things are going to happen. And I think, you know, okay, there's always probably going to be a film archive in Bologna or wherever else where you can, you know, watch Charlie Chaplin falling over a rug, or you can watch Buster Keaton, you know, eating spaghetti. That's all great fun, but it's not really relevant to anymore. And I think if you're going to be involved in some notion of the cinematic idea, you should concentrate on that thing and forget the big cinema in the sky. Is that disappointing news for you?
No.
Did you want to be the next Scorsese?
No.
Okay.
It was my objective.
All right, did you want to be the next Fellini then? I mean, maybe that's better than more. No, what did you want to be?
In acting, actually.
Acting.
Theatre acting and cinema.
No, I mean, you know, the ancient Greeks, or before the ancient Greeks, created the 6 art forms, so they're very, 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 very old. And to be an actor, all you have to do is stand in the corner and talk to me. That's enough. You don't need cameras, you don't need lights, you don't need the scenery. You know, if you want to be a writer, you know, it's very easy. You find a piece of chalk and you write on a cliff face. All the basic art forms are very, very simple and very, very cheap. If you want to be a painter, take a little grease to the side of your nose and write it on the back of your palm. There's the painting. You don't need, you know, huge canvases in the Sistine Chapel to do it. So all the art forms are very, very simple and technologically very, very cheap. So they're never going to die. They're always going to be there, always going to be there. But cinema is so complicated, even though I'm looking at that cheap little vulgar camera there on the tripod, it's still, you know, quite complicated. It has to be reprocessed. You have to get to your audience in all sorts of common ways. And I've only got to bend down and take that plug out of there, and he's dead. He's absolutely dead. He's totally related and slave to that form of electricity. And that's not true with a painter, you know. I can take, you know, elephant shit and make a painting, no problem, no problem. But he's lost without electricity. So, you know, he's wasting his time really, isn't he? Cosmically. We're all thinking cosmically now, aren't we? Yes? Do you think cosmically? We all do, don't we? You know, we're worried about big subjects like, you know, about pollution and overpopulation, and these are big, big, big subjects. And my greatest worry is that most people now are looking for alien life. And that is going to be an absolute disaster. When we find it, the history of life, the superior form always kills off the inferior form. And if we're found by somebody else, we're found by superior. So that's us, finished. Absolutely finished. Think about when Europeans went to North America. Within 100 years, all the Indians were dead. It'll be like that. And if it works around the other way, if we're the conquerors and we find alien life, we will do that, but in reverse. Again, think what Europeans did in North America. Wiped out the whole civilization, the whole enormous culture. So 3 worries. Don't let's overpopulate. I should be careful about saying that because I have 4 children. Let's, for Christ's sake, look after the planet in a lot better way than Mr. Trump. But third thing, let's stop this stupid idea of trying to find aliens, because that's the end of us. Okay? Have I said all the right things in the right order?
I think so. If you want to add something, of course, you can...
No, I want to save something back. There are 2 more interviews coming.
Okay. Well, then, thank you very
My
much.
pleasure.
For being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.